King Charles may have just made one of the most important statements of his reign. And the strange part? It wasn't necessarily about changing the line of succession. It wasn't about removing Prince William, and it wasn't even about announcing a new title. It was about something much more powerful in the modern monarchy, who the public sees when they think about the future of the crown. Because while William remains the heir, Catherine has increasingly become something else entirely. The emotional center, the familiar face, the public watches when the institution needs warmth, stability, and reassurance. And now, with Charles continuing to navigate the later chapters of his reign, one question is becoming impossible to ignore. Is Catherine already being positioned as the crown's next great public leader? And if that's what Charles has been quietly preparing for, then his latest moves suddenly look very different. Because this isn't really a story about a crown. It's a story about who carries the weight of the monarchy next. Before we go any further, there's one thing we need to make absolutely clear. Prince William remains first in line to the British throne. Nothing has officially changed that. There has been no constitutional announcement removing William, no legal transfer of succession, and no evidence of a literal ceremony in which Charles crowned Catherine as monarch. But that's actually what makes this story more interesting, because the British monarchy has always operated on two different levels. There's the legal monarchy, and then there's the emotional monarchy. One is defined by constitutional rules. The other is defined by the person people trust, recognize, and emotionally connect with. And Catherine has been quietly building extraordinary strength in that second category. So today, we're going to break down what Charles's latest public moves could mean, why Catherine's position has become so important, and why the future of the monarchy may depend on much more than simply knowing who comes next in line. Because once you understand that distinction, the entire royal picture changes. So let's begin with the question everyone is asking. Why Catherine? Why has she become such an important figure in discussions about the monarchy's future? The answer isn't simply her marriage to William. It's not her title. And it isn't even her position as Princess of Wales. It's what happened to her relationship with the public. For years, Catherine was watched constantly. Her clothes, her expressions, her appearances, her relationship with William, her children. Every public appearance could become a headline. But something changed dramatically when she faced her own health crisis. Suddenly, the public stopped looking at her simply as a royal. They started looking at her as a person, a mother, a wife, a woman facing uncertainty. And that changed the emotional equation. The institution didn't have to manufacture sympathy. It happened naturally. And that kind of public connection is extraordinarily valuable to a monarchy. Because you can't order it, you can't legislate it, and you certainly can't create it with a press release. But here's where the story becomes much more interesting. Catherine didn't simply disappear and return. Her absence created a vacuum, and that vacuum showed the palace something extremely important. People noticed when she wasn't there. They asked where she was. They followed updates about her recovery. They waited for her return. And when she finally began appearing publicly again, the reaction wasn't merely curiosity. There was relief. That distinction matters, because the monarchy survives on continuity. People want to see familiar faces. They want reassurance. They want to believe that the institution they're watching today will still be recognizable tomorrow. And Catherine suddenly became connected to that feeling. She represented recovery, family, stability, and resilience. That's why her role today cannot simply be measured by how many engagements she attends. Her real value is emotional, and Charles knows that. Now consider Charles himself. He waited decades to become king. His reign began under enormous expectations because he inherited the throne from one of the most recognizable monarchs in modern history. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years building an image of stability. Charles inherited the institution, but he also inherited the challenge of keeping it relevant. That's not easy. The modern monarchy exists in a completely different world. Social media has transformed how people interact with public figures. Younger generations question institutions more aggressively. Traditional deference has weakened, and every royal decision is analyzed within minutes. So Charles has had to navigate a difficult balance, preserve tradition while making the monarchy feel modern, respect history while preparing for the future, and perhaps most importantly, build a bridge between his generation and William's. That is where Catherine becomes strategically important, because Catherine belongs to the next generation. But she also understands the traditions of the institution. She's close enough to the old monarchy to respect it, and modern enough to communicate with a completely different audience. And this brings us to Prince William. Because here's the part that many people get wrong. Catherine's growing influence does not mean William is being pushed aside. In fact, the opposite may be true. William is the future king. Catherine is his future queen. The strength of their partnership is precisely what makes their combined role so powerful. Think about the structure. William represents constitutional continuity. Catherine represents emotional connection. William will inherit the crown. Catherine will help shape how that crown is perceived. And that's why Charles doesn't need to choose between them. He doesn't need to say William or Catherine. The real strategy is William with Catherine. The king may be preparing not for one future leader, but for a leadership partnership. And that is a much more interesting story. Now let's return to the image at the center of your title, the crown. A crown isn't merely jewelry. For centuries, it has represented authority, responsibility, continuity, and service. But there's another meaning people often overlook: weight. A crown is heavy because responsibility is heavy. And that's why the idea of Charles symbolically crowning Catherine can be understood as a metaphor for something already happening inside the monarchy. Catherine is being given more responsibility, more visibility, more trust, and potentially more influence over how the institution communicates with the public. That's the real story. Not that Catherine suddenly became queen. She didn't. Not that William was removed. He wasn't. But that Catherine's importance to the future identity of the monarchy appears to be growing. And once you see it that way, the symbolism becomes much more powerful. Because the monarchy doesn't operate like a normal company. A corporation can replace a CEO. A political party can elect a new leader. But a constitutional monarchy depends heavily on continuity. The public needs to recognize the people representing it. And Catherine has something incredibly difficult to manufacture: familiarity without constant controversy. She has spent years learning the system. She understands royal protocol. She knows how to speak publicly. She understands the importance of family. And after everything she has experienced, there is another quality that has become increasingly visible. Resilience. That's important because future monarchies will need personalities who can survive intense scrutiny. The next generation won't be protected from criticism. They'll face more of it, faster, louder, and globally. Catherine has already experienced that environment, and she has learned how to operate inside it. This is also where comparisons with Princess Diana become unavoidable. Not because Catherine is another Diana, she isn't. Their personalities are different, their approaches to royal life were different, and their relationships with the institution were dramatically different. But there is one similarity. Both understood the emotional side of public life. Diana could walk into a room and change the atmosphere. Catherine has developed a quieter version of that ability. She doesn't need to dominate a room. She doesn't need to make a dramatic speech. Sometimes her presence is enough, and that's precisely why her public value is so difficult to measure through traditional royal metrics. A royal engagement can be counted. A speech can be recorded. A charity visit can be documented. But emotional trust, that's harder. And yet it may be the most important currency the monarchy possesses. Now let's address the constitutional side, because this is where sensational royal headlines can become misleading. The British monarchy has an established succession. Charles is king. William is first in line. Then comes Prince George, followed by Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. That order has not been replaced by a symbolic gesture. The official succession remains the legal foundation. So if someone tells you Catherine has literally become the new monarch while Charles is still king, that's not what has happened. But here's the fascinating part. A person can gain enormous institutional importance without becoming the constitutional sovereign. Think about the role of a future queen. She can influence charitable priorities. She can shape public messaging. She can build relationships with communities. She can become associated with specific causes. She can help define the personality of an entire era. And that's the power Catherine appears to be moving toward. Not legal power, cultural power. Charles' greatest challenge may therefore have nothing to do with succession. It may be relevance. The monarchy has to survive changing public expectations. It has to prove that tradition can coexist with modern life. And it has to make people feel that royal service still has meaning. Charles has spent much of his life advocating environmental causes, architecture, sustainability, and charitable work. But the future monarchy will need another layer. Emotional accessibility. That's where William and Catherine become so important. William can provide continuity. Catherine can provide connection. George represents the generation after them. And suddenly, the institution has a potential multi-generational bridge. Charles's job isn't simply to be king. It's to prepare the institution he inherited for the people who will inherit it after him. And that means identifying strengths before they are needed. This is why the most important royal transitions often happen long before an actual succession. Nobody waits until the day a monarch dies to suddenly teach the next generation how to represent the crown. The preparation happens gradually. Public engagements, ceremonial responsibilities, international appearances, military associations, charitable work, state occasions, every appearance teaches the public something. It tells them, this is who we are. This is what they represent. This is what the future looks like. And Catherine has been accumulating those experiences for years. So when people describe her as a future queen, they're not simply talking about a title. They're talking about accumulated public credibility. That credibility may ultimately be one of her greatest assets. But there's one part of this story that deserves even more attention. Catherine's influence isn't just about Britain. The modern monarchy is global. A royal appearance can generate headlines across dozens of countries within minutes. A photograph can reach millions. A speech can be translated instantly. And Catherine has demonstrated that she can generate enormous international attention without constantly creating controversy. That is rare. And for a monarchy trying to remain relevant in the digital age, it's invaluable. The future crown won't be experienced only through newspapers or television. It will be experienced through phones, through short videos, through photographs, through social media, through moments that ordinary people share because they feel genuine. And Catherine is particularly well suited to that environment. So when we look at Charles' recent public positioning, the smarter interpretation isn't. Charles has replaced William with Catherine. That's not supported by the constitutional reality. The more interesting interpretation is Charles is helping define what the future monarchy should feel like, and Catherine may be one of the central people in that vision. That's a much bigger story, because William's reign will eventually arrive. When it does, the question won't simply be, who is king? Everyone will know. The real question will be, what kind of monarchy is William leading? And Catherine will have a major role in answering that question. Will it be formal, modern, family-focused, community-oriented, digitally connected, more emotionally open? Her presence can influence all of those things, and we can't ignore the experience that transformed public perception of Catherine more than almost anything else, her health journey. When someone who has spent years being scrutinized suddenly faces a deeply personal crisis, the public gets to see something different. Not the polished royal, not the carefully dressed princess, not the person standing behind a podium, but the human being underneath the title. And Catherine's decision to speak publicly about her health created an unusual moment. Millions of people could relate to the fear, the uncertainty, the desire to protect family, and the long road back to normality. That experience changed how many people viewed her, and it may have changed how she views the institution herself, because leadership after vulnerability looks different. You become more aware of what ordinary people are carrying, and that may eventually become one of Catherine's defining qualities. There's another reason Catherine matters: her children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince Louis. When people look at Catherine, they're not just looking at the Princess of Wales. They're looking at the mother raising the next generation of the monarchy. And that creates a unique emotional connection. People can imagine George becoming king one day. They can imagine Charlotte and Louis supporting him. But they also see Catherine standing beside them, guiding them, protecting them, preparing them. That creates continuity across generations. And for Charles, that must be an important part of legacy, because eventually his reign will become history. William's reign will become the present, and George's reign will become the future. Catherine sits directly between those worlds. She's part of the bridge. Every monarch eventually faces the same question: what did I leave behind? For Charles, The answer won't simply be buildings, speeches, legislation, or royal engagements. His deeper legacy may be whether he successfully stabilized the monarchy for the next generation. And that means preparing William, supporting Catherine, protecting George, and ensuring the institution remains relevant. That's why Catherine's increasing prominence could become one of Charles' most significant achievements. Not because he made her queen. He hasn't. Not because he changed succession. He hasn't. But because he may be helping establish the public architecture of the monarchy that comes after him. And that is something historians could eventually view as extremely important. And this brings us back to the phrase, Charles's last public act. Whether or not this literally becomes his final public act is impossible to know. Kings don't announce the end of their reign through dramatic countdowns. But if we're talking symbolically, there is something powerful about Charles spending this stage of his reign emphasizing the people who will carry the institution forward. That includes William, and perhaps just as importantly, Catherine, because a future king needs more than a crown. He needs someone capable of connecting that crown to ordinary people. And Catherine may be uniquely positioned to do that. So the image of Charles placing a crown beside Catherine shouldn't be interpreted as a literal constitutional event. It works better as a symbol, a visual representation of something that has been developing for years, the transfer of responsibility, the transfer of trust, the transfer of expectation. And suddenly, all the pieces connect. Charles inherited a monarchy built around extraordinary continuity. He faced the challenge of modernizing it without destroying its traditions. Catherine faced one of the most difficult personal chapters of her life. She stepped back, she recovered, she returned, and when she did, millions of people watched. William continued preparing for his future role. George grew closer to the point where the public began imagining him as the next generation of the crown. And Catherine? She became something increasingly important. The bridge, the person who can make tradition feel human, the person who can make duty feel personal, the person who can stand between generations and make the monarchy feel like one continuous story. That is why her importance cannot be measured by whether she has the word Queen in front of her name today. Her influence is already much bigger than that. So did King Charles literally crown Catherine as the crown's new leader? No verified evidence establishes that. And constitutionally, William remains the heir. But if the deeper question is whether Charles has been helping prepare Catherine for a much larger role in the future of the monarchy, then the answer becomes far more interesting. Because the crown is not just a piece of metal, it's an idea, it's continuity, it's responsibility, it's public trust. And eventually, every monarch has to decide who they believe can carry that weight. Charles may not have handed Catherine the throne, but through the responsibilities, visibility, trust, and symbolism surrounding her position, he may be doing something almost as significant. He may be preparing the public to see her not simply as William's wife, not simply as the future queen, but as one of the people who will define what the British monarchy becomes next. And perhaps that's the real meaning behind the crown. Not power transferred, but responsibility entrusted. Not William being pushed aside, but William and Catherine being prepared together. And not Charles disappearing, but Charles making sure that when his chapter eventually closes, the institution he spent his life preparing for doesn't close with him. Because when history looks back at the Charles era, the most important question may not be how long he ruled. It may be this: did he successfully prepare the crown for what came next? And if Catherine's growing role is any indication, he may already be writing that answer.